everyone, and welcome to another episode of Open Source Diaries, where we discuss how open source intersects with different industries and fields. And today we have an amazing guest who'll be talking about how open source cuts across data science. So, our guest today has over 20 years of experience within the open source space and has worked at like several open source and also non-open source organizations. So I know you're dying to hear from her, but so am I. Good to have you here, Don.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. All right. So before we jump in, right, I know so many persons have been dying to ask this question. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and how you got into data science as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first got exposed to open source really when I was at university. So we used some open source tools, and I took a Unix system administration class, and we actually had some Linux systems as a part of that course. So that was probably in 93 or 94. So Linux was very new and not really used within companies. And because I had taken this sysadmin course, I was able to somehow luck into a full time role as a Unix system administrator at a company right out of university. And that was in 1995. And at that point, I worked for a manufacturing company. And manufacturing companies do not like to spend money on IT. So I used a lot of open source software. And this was when it was really quite difficult to use open source because we didn't have these fabulous package managers filled with open source technologies that you could just install. So you were installing things and compiling it from source, and it was quite a lot of work, frankly, to use open source. But I persevered because I thought it was pretty cool. And like I said, they wouldn't really spend money on tools. So I was kind of using open source because that's what I had access to. And then fast forward to so that was in started in 1995, and I did that for a couple of years. And then in 2000, I got a job at Intel, and they had this brand new processor that required a lot of rewriting of software, and they didn't really have anybody looking at some of the open source developer tools and Linux developer tools to figure out which ones needed to run on this new processor. So they looked at me and they were like, "Well, you used to do Unix, which is close enough to Linux, and you know what open source is, which is a lot more than a lot of people at Intel knew back in 2000 because it was very much a Microsoft shop. So they were really close partners with Microsoft, and they really weren't doing much in open source at the time. That's completely changed now. At the time, they didn't really do much in open source. So they asked me to go out and look at which open source developer tools and which Linux developer tools were likely to be strategic for Intel over the long term, or basically being in use over the long term, so that we could work with them to get them running on this new processor. And I got more and more fascinated with how these communities worked because, it was really kind of amazing that you had these communities of random people working together to produce software that was frankly very, very good. And so I got more and more interested in figuring out how that worked. And so I spent a lot of time looking at open source communities, and I spent a lot of time doing what I would call corporate open source, which is really helping Intel at the time and later other companies figure out what to do with open source, figure out who to talk to, how to work within these communities. So I spent a lot of time providing advice internally within my company about open source. So I did that for quite a while, and as I said, I got really interested in the community side of things. And I was giving a talk at a conference. This was probably 2006 or so. And somebody I knew who was also at this conference heard me give this talk about community. And he said, "Hey, I'm on the board of this little startup that's doing some open source stuff, and they've got some community issues. Would you leave Intel and come work for us and help us work on this?" And that's when I turned open source into kind of a full-time open source community manager role. And I continued to do that for almost 10 years, actually. So I did that at a startup that doesn't exist anymore, Jive Software, which also I think probably doesn't exist anymore. And then I also did it again at Intel. I went back to Intel, and then I worked at Puppet as their director of community. And then I decided in 2015 that for my midlife crisis, this was, yeah, 10 years ago, I was in my mid 40s. I decided that I was going to sell my house, sell my car, quit my job, and move from Portland, Oregon to London, England. And so I packed myself up and moved to London to get a PhD. And I studied the Linux kernel. And I looked at how people collaborate together within the kernel. So I did a lot of analysis of basically mailing list posts along with source code analysis. And so all of this involved using a lot of data science tools. So this was, it was a lot of Python code. It was a bunch of statistical code in R. And I was looking at, these networks of people within the Linux kernel. So it was really, I spent a few years doing kind of the basics of data science within this PhD program. But I wasn't new to open source metrics and new to data, because all of that time that I'd been a community manager, the 10 years before I went back to school to get a PhD, I had spent a lot of time looking at metrics, because it's hard to justify these community roles within companies. And so I always needed data to really show people that I was doing something that was worthwhile and worth them continuing to pay me to do that. So the data and metrics piece had always been a piece of what I'd been working on. And then when I finished my PhD, I had a role as an open source strategist at Pivotal, and then later at VMware when we got acquired by VMware. But still, data was still a big piece of it. So I still contributed to Chaos. I still did a lot of, frankly, like analysis of some of our GitHub organizations and GitHub repositories, and did a lot of data analysis. So this data science piece had never actually been my full-time job, but it had been bits and pieces of, the last, I don't know, 15 years or so of my career. So the data science piece had always been a bit of what I had done. And then this role came up for Chaos, where they wanted someone to do data science. And I had, some technical skills around data science, but also a big part of data science. And I think a lot of people just think about like the data piece. But a big part of being a data scientist and being in a role like what I am in Chaos is being able to help people use the data that they have. So what does this data mean? What can you do with it? And so this is why I think there's been such a big focus on things like the practitioner guides within Chaos, to really just help people use the data that they have to actually do something really useful with it, which is a big part of my role within Chaos.
Wow, that is an interesting background. First off, I am fascinated by how you're able to progress with your career from, open source not even having like a formal structure. And I'm curious, how was using these tools or even trying to like get involved with this project way back then, when there was very little to no structure around the open source project that existed?
I would say when I was a system administrator, I really was an enthusiastic user of open source. So I didn't really contribute back to it. And the reason I said it was quite difficult is, now we have package managers which understand the dependencies that are required. If you install something via a package manager on Linux, RPM or packaging or Homebrew on the Mac, it knows what the dependencies are and it installs those for you. So back when I was doing this, you would try to install something and it would just fail miserably because you didn't have dependency X. Okay, so I'll go and I'll get dependency X and then try to install that, and then it fails because it has a dependency on something else. And so you get into this dependency hell where you keep going back and back to try to find all of the dependencies for all the things you need to install so that you can actually install the actual thing that you need. And so that's why I would say it was quite difficult. Yeah, and like I said, I didn't at the time, I didn't really contribute to open source. I spent a lot of time, helping people understand the way it worked. So rather than making direct contributions, I spent a number of years working within companies just trying to help them understand what it was and what to do with it.
That's interesting. Okay, so in your view, how would you say data science and open source kind of like intersect? And I heard you talk about like corporate open source and how you help them manage their data and all of that. How do they actually intersect in one way?
I would say that there are lots of ways that data science and open source intersect. The most direct connection is probably focused on a lot of the work that we do within the chaos project. So if you look at these open source projects, you have all of this data, right? So so you have all of these metrics that you can use to measure the work that you're doing within open source. And so within things like, open source program offices, or developer relations teams, having people who can dig into the data, the metrics about open source projects, I think can be really valuable, because it can help you as your company understand how how these open source projects work, how healthy they are, what's happening within these projects, how risky are they from a usage standpoint. There's all sorts of things that you can use the metrics and the data to understand, which is why a lot of these open source program offices have people who are focused on data science. So, Red Hat has a data scientist. Google has a couple of people who I think their titles are probably program manager, but realistically they do data science. So even the people that don't have maybe a data science title, a lot of them end up doing metrics and data science work within these open source teams within companies.
So, how would you say metrics, like, why is metrics for start important within the open source space? Like, I've heard you talk about metrics from chaos and also like program offices, but like, why is metrics even a thing of conversation within the open source space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I tend to look at it in two different ways. So one is around what I'll call consumption or use of open source. So if I'm working within a company and I'm building products and they have these open source technologies embedded within their products, or they're building their products on top of these open source technologies, certain metrics can really help you understand the long-term viability of those tools that you're using and help you make good choices. So if you have a choice between, technology A and technology B, and you look at the metrics, and technology A is maintained by a single developer and hasn't had any security patches in who knows how long, and technology B, your other option, has maybe 10 maintainers from 5 different companies, and they release security patches all the time. I can use that data and those metrics to decide that maybe technology B is a better choice for me to use. So that's on the consumption side, or the usage side. And then there's also the contribution metrics. So in general, it's a pretty good practice if you're using open source technologies in a pretty serious way, like you're building your technologies on top of it, or maybe you have some open source projects within your company. You should also be looking at the contribution metrics. So looking at, who contributes to those projects, who, are they in who are the people who are in leadership positions? Are there opportunities for maybe your employees to contribute and move into leadership positions within those projects? And the metrics can give you some insight into that. So you can see, maybe if all of the developers work for a single company, then maybe your employees aren't going to feel welcome within that project. And the metrics can only tell you so much. There's also a huge amount of interpretation that you have to do on top of it. But I would say that that's kind of how I look at the metrics from a company standpoint.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering, like, what are the responsibilities of a data scientist within an open source space? And, like, are these responsibilities any different from, let's say, working in a corporate open source space and then maybe like in proprietary softwares? Like, what exactly differentiates one from the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that a lot of the data scientist, I think the skills and a lot of the work that you do are going to be similar, whether you're working within an open source project or you're, working within a company. And so I think, working within an open source project is a little bit different because it depends a lot on what the project needs, right? So, if you look at some of the contributions within chaos, for example, so there's, people like Callie Dolphy, who's a data scientist at Red Hat, is helping to build tools that visualize these metrics on top of Augur. So she's actually working on tooling to help other people use metrics in a way that's more intuitive. But with the data science background, she has a really good sense for what people need and how to put that together. And then there've been other cases where I've been working within open source projects and just ended up doing data analysis because there was something we needed to understand about the data. So, looking at, maybe, who are the people who are in leadership positions, or looking at metrics. In some cases, I actually wrote a bunch of code to help us figure out who was eligible to vote within steering committee elections that involved some, I don't know, some GitHub API work. And so that was, within just just kind of a random project. It was just a little data project that I picked up. So there are lots of different ways within open source projects that they need data work. Like, there are just times when you really need to understand some things about your project, or you have a question about your project, and you need someone with a data science or metrics background of some sort to help you answer those questions. And then I would say the work within proprietary companies is maybe a little bit different, in the sense that the questions are probably going to be different. But it on the other hand, it's very similar, because it's, your company maybe has some questions about this open source project, and you need to gather some data to answer those questions. But in some cases, in a corporate setting, it might be, who else is contributing to this project, or who are the people who are in leadership positions, or maybe they have more technical questions about the project that they need some data to solve. So the questions, I think, are a little bit different, but I think the end result is pretty similar. It ends up coming down to data and metrics about projects.
Okay. All right. So, how would you say, like, in terms of collaboration? Because now I believe that while working in the open source space too, you get to like interact with other persons within the community, either the engineers or the maintainers or whoever is on that particular team, right? How do you manage collaborations within that particular space and effectively communicate what needs to be done? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I think is very, very important. There was a paper that was published in, I think, ACM Communications, and it was Amanda Cesari, Julia Ferrioli, and I think Juniper Lovato, I think, were the authors on that paper, and it was called Beyond the Repository. And one of the things that they talk about in this paper, which is something that I've thought was important for many years before this paper came out, but it's that collaboration between the people looking at the data and the people actually doing the work in the project is absolutely critical, because the data can only tell you so much, and you look at the data and you draw conclusions based on it. But if you don't actually talk to the people who are doing the work, then in a lot of cases your conclusions aren't going to make any sense. It's interesting. So Sophia Vargas, who's another chaos contributor, she works at Google, and she tells the story of she was doing all this analysis, and there was something very strange happening with the issues, where they were almost always closed after a certain number of days. And I think it was maybe 90 days, something like that. And she's like, this doesn't make any sense. I don't understand what's happening here. and she was looking at the Kubernetes community, and she started talking to some of the Kubernetes contributors, and they were like, oh yeah, we have a bot that auto closes issues if they've been open and there's been no activity for 90 days. So there was this weird thing going on in the data that just the data itself could not explain until you went and talked to the people who are actually doing the work, and they were like, oh yeah, that's easy, that's because of, because of this. And the other thing you see a lot in open source projects is when you're looking at activity, you're like, wow, the activities, like the activity level's really down, like what's happening in this project. And then you realize it's because all of the developers are in Europe and they're all on vacation in August. And so, yeah, there's not much going on in that project. Maybe that's a good thing that there's not much activity, because it means that these developers are actually taking vacation and enjoying themselves and not working themselves to death. So, until you actually talk to these people and understand what's going on within these projects, having that collaborative relationship between the people looking at the data and the people doing the work, I think is absolutely critical to understanding what's going on.
All right. So from like the community standpoint, right? I know you can get data from either the GitHub repositories, and yeah, you talked about earlier that open source metrics tend to like also look at the community aspect. So now, how do you ensure that the metrics or like the data you're collecting from things that don't seem very much measurable, like how are people engaging in the community? How is the response to questions? Or how are people also using a particular project? Like those type of metrics that are not easily measurable, how do you actually account for those?
Yeah, so that's something that is so important in open source projects. There are things that make this difficult, right? So there are a lot of contributions to open source that really may not be visible in the metrics, right? So you've got people doing community management, people doing product management, program management, documentation. There's all of this stuff that happens around these open source projects that may or may not actually be visible in the, especially if you're looking at something like GitHub. And so this is where talking to the people who work in the project is really important, and asking people, what else is going on, who's working on what. And I think especially when you're working within a company, but also just when you're working to understand open source projects, a big part of it is kind of storytelling. So it's you've got some data, you've gotten an interpretation, but then a lot of times you have to talk about the other things that are happening that are influencing the project in some way. So it's not all about hard data. A lot of it is about talking to people and spending time with people. And it's really interesting because I've been doing it's kind of a data science project within Chaos about looking at projects that have relicensed, gone from open source to not open source, and then the forks that were a result of that. And I've spent a lot of time gathering data about it, but I've also spent quite a bit of time talking to the people who work within these projects to better understand it. And every time I talked to someone, there was always something that, they were like, well, you see this in the data, but that's kind of misleading, because yes, that person has a huge number of commits, but they had this big formatting PR. So if you look, almost all of that changes in this one pull request where they made a whole bunch of formatting updates. So you wouldn't necessarily understand that, or you wouldn't necessarily come across that in the data if you didn't know to look for it. So having those conversations and those collaborations with people to understand the stuff that you might not, either you're not seeing in the data or might not be in the data at all, because there are people doing this kind of invisible work within open source projects. And the only way you can find that is really by participating in the community and talking to people.
Sure. All right. So talking about like the data science initiative at Chaos, right? If somebody, let's say, is interested in getting involved in this project as either a contributor or someone who is also willing to just learn more about the effort, how do they get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the data science community within Chaos, we have a few things that happen. So we have a Slack channel where people can always come and ask questions and chat about the work that we're doing within Chaos. We have meetings every other Tuesday. So we have those regular meetings where we talk about all the work that happens within the data science community within Chaos. So those are two ways that you can start to engage in that community. And then there are loads of things to work on within Chaos, within the data science community. We have projects that we're working on. So we're doing this relicensing and forks project. So I've been looking a lot at the organizational affiliation analysis, and then Chan Bong and Peculiar C. Uma, the two of them have been working on some additional project health metrics. So looking at what else is going on within these projects. And then we have another project that's looking at what happens when companies donate open source projects to foundations. So they're doing some analysis on projects that were owned by a company and now are owned by a foundation, and looking for what changes when that happens. And then just starting to kick off another project looking at archival of projects, particularly popular projects that get archived, and looking at maybe why that happens. That, like I said, that one's kind of just starting. I was just starting to gather some data about that yesterday and this morning. And then we have loads of other projects that are kind of on the back burner that nobody's started yet. And then other people can propose projects. So Sophia Vargas had this idea about trying to contribute taxonomies. So a big part of analyzing data is just categorizing it in some way and getting people to contribute their taxonomies, and doing that within the Chaos Data Science Initiative. So that was something that she just had this idea, and so we just kind of started it to see, and we'll see what happens with it. That one also started relatively recently. And then the other thing we do within the data science working group is what we call practitioner guides. So these are guides that help people use the data that they have and use it to make improvements to their projects, or make improvements in some ways. So we have one on responsiveness, contributor sustainability, organizational participation, security. And then we have 3 more that are in the works. We have a diverse leadership guide. There's a guide about sunsetting open source projects. So that one should come out in the next week or 2. And I'm also working on one about demonstrating the value of the work that you do within open source. So we also have these guides that are really like, there's no hardcore data science analysis required for these guides. It's really about understanding the data and knowing what to do with it, and then knowing how to make improvements within open source projects. So all of that work happens within the data science working group within Chaos. So anyone's welcome to join us.
Okay, so assuming someone wants to get involved, are there like any technical skills or any knowledge requirements before they can get involved in this initiative as well?
No, actually. So this is one of the interesting things about data science, is that I'd be willing to bet that if you ask 10 data scientists what they do, you would get 10 different answers. And the reason is because, data science means different things. Like I don't do any machine learning or AI. There are other data scientists who do nothing but machine learning and artificial intelligence. I don't. It's not really needed with the work that we do. In the process of doing data science work, there are loads of steps, and there are ways that people can participate without having any specialized skills. So for example, as part of the organizational affiliation analysis for these relicensing and forks, I spent a lot of time looking people up on LinkedIn to try to figure out where they worked. So this is just like a thing that someone has to do as a part of cleaning up the data. We're going to have a data science hackathon right after the Open Source Summit in Denver. And one of the project that I'm planning on leading for that hackathon is around these archived projects, and looking at popular projects that have been archived and understanding why. And the understanding why a project has been archived is going to mean actually going out and looking at the README for that project or the URL for that project and reading what they said about why they archived it. And you really can't easily automate that. Like I can automate a lot of, I can get all the links and I can get a whole bunch of data about the projects from GitHub, but somebody's going to have to click on that project URL and go and look at the README for us to understand why. And so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to lead the part of the hackathon for people who aren't going to write any Python, who aren't going to write any code, who aren't going to do any statistics. But it's an important part of data science. Data science is really, I think people would be surprised how much time data scientists spend on these ridiculous manual like data cleaning efforts. But it's something we all do, and we all talk about it when we get together. I can't count the number of conversations we've had about these sorts of things within the data science working group. It's something that we all do, and it's something that doesn't require any special data science skills. And that can be kind of an inroads into it. So you can help with data science projects and help with some of this manual effort. And as a part of doing that, you'll learn more about some of the other things that are going on with the project. And it can be a good way to get started and a good way to build some skills.
That's actually interesting because when I think of data science, my mind runs to like machine learning and AI and all of that. But like listening to all of the projects and like the programs and efforts you're doing with these initiatives says otherwise, which is really encouraging because now I feel like maybe I should change the career path to data science because it seems so interesting. Now, saying how interesting data science comes off, what is the most natural entry point you can suggest for anyone who has interest in getting into open source and specifically for data scientists? And how would you suggest they should proceed moving forward?
Oh, it's a hard question because because of what we talked about, which is that data scientists do very different things. But I would say that most of the interesting things that I've gotten involved in that from a data science perspective has been just something that I had a question about or something that I found interesting. And so then you start digging into the data, and then you figure out what additional skills you need to learn in order to more effectively do that. And I would say that has probably been that's been key to learning the skills that I needed to do the data science work that I do now. Is I've got maybe this question about something, and then I spend a lot of time figuring out how to write some Python code to do this. And I do have a computer science background, so I did write some code a very very long time ago. But when I started doing data science work, I really kind of had to relearn it, and I ended up really teaching myself both Python and R. And it was because well, I've got all this mailing list data, and at the time it was in a MySQL or MariaDB database, and I was like, well, I've got to get this out, and I have to do it in a reliable way and a repeatable way, because as part of a PhD program, you've got to be able to repeat things. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll learn some Python so that I can pull this data out of out of this database. And so I basically learned enough to be able to do that. And same thing, like when I was looking at I was looking at some repository data. So I was at VMware, and we had all of this GitHub data, and we had someone who was copying and pasting things from GitHub and putting it in a spreadsheet. And I was like, ooh, GitHub has an API. I bet I can figure that out and put this in a spreadsheet for you so that you're not manually copying and pasting things. And so I learned enough about the GitHub API in order to, reduce this manual work that someone on my team was doing. And so a lot of what I've learned has just been, I'm curious about this thing, or somebody's doing this work that seems too manual, and I bet we can automate that. And so I think that really is one of the best ways to get involved in data projects in general, is because it's something that's interesting to you. So you're curious about something, and there's some data, and figuring out how you can analyze it, summarize it, draw conclusions from it, I think is a good way to get started, because then it's at least it's something that you're personally interested in.
Sure. All right. So, what would you count as a win when someone is getting started? For instance, this is my first time getting into open source as a data scientist. What can I count as a win for a first time contribution, for instance?
Oh, I would say any first time contribution is a win. Any time you can make a contribution, and it doesn't have to be a code contribution on GitHub. It can be providing feedback on something someone's doing. That can be an easy way to kind of get a win. If you have if somebody has a data project and they're analyzing data and they're summarizing it, for example, providing someone with some feedback, that can be a really easy win, I think, from a data standpoint. But the other thing you can look at is there are loads of like smaller research and scientific software projects that are very much kind of data first. And so I think getting involved in maybe some of those projects. I think personally, I don't contribute to any of those. I've used loads of them, but if you're just interested in doing some work, and it's more around the data side, some of those research and scientific software projects are always looking for contributors. And so that might be an interesting way to get that first win, that first contribution.
Okay. All right. So, are there any projects that you can recommend for those who would want to jump on open source contributions with their data science skills?
Well, chaos would be my first choice. I mean, that's the project that I'm focused on, and we are a very beginner friendly project. So I do think the chaos project is a really nice way to participate, particularly for the people who are interested in data. Yeah, yeah, that would be my pick. I'm biased, admittedly, but we're a very beginner friendly project, and we're very data focused because the metrics has been what we do. So it's a good place to start.
There's a whole lot of ways to get started with chaos. All right. So, what advice or final words can you say to anyone out there who want to get into open source as a data scientist?
Yeah. So I would say just jump in and give it a try. I think there's a lot to be said for just picking something and getting started. But I would also say, think about the projects that you're contributing to. And if you don't feel welcome in a project, just go somewhere else. Find another project where you do feel welcome. I would say, look for the right fit for you, a project that feels comfortable for you, that's doing things that are interesting for you, and spend some time, like, picking where you want to participate. I think is probably my biggest piece of advice, because there are loads of really fabulous, friendly open source projects, and there are some projects that aren't as friendly. So don't waste your time on those. Just find one where you feel comfortable, where the people are kind, where people are helpful. And I would say, ask people for advice. So if you have questions about things, like you don't know where to get started, you don't know what to do, talk to people, ask people. Generally, if it's a nice, friendly, welcoming community, people will usually be happy to answer questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Don. This has been so insightful and also inspiring to hear your stories all up to this point. I will also share some of the resources that you mentioned and the project chaos that you talked about for those who'd want to get interested. And that being said, that is all for today's episode. If you come across this, please make sure to like and also subscribe and share it with a friend as well. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.